allyship, promoting the importance of allyship, and not just allyship, but actionable allyship, right? So let's see. So in 2017, I had a chance to participate in the Women's March on Washington. And one of the things that really stood out for me, and I don't know if you all can see the little blue arrows, were the number of men who were there. And it wasn't just men, but you had people from all over the world. So you could walk around, you would hear different languages, you would hear, you know, people talking and celebrating and supporting one another. And for me, this was really powerful. And it was a powerful reminder that um, if you look at every major movement in history, there have always been allies supporting that movement. Whether we're talking about the women's suffrage movement, where you had men, you had a men's league for women's suffrage movement, whether we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, the civil rights movement, whether we're talking about movement for LGBT rights, you've always had people who aligned themselves with the cause, even though they weren't directly impacted by, some of the experiences that the individuals who identify with that cause have to experience. And so I think this is a really good definition of allyship because there are certain elements to this where there's a call to action in it, right? And like I said, it's really important when we think about allyship that we also think about sincerity, intentionality, and authenticity, and most importantly, action, right? So this definition, just have to move that over a little bit. There we go. Okay, now I can see it. It says that allyship is a strategic mechanism used by individuals to become collaborators, accomplices, and conspirators who fight injustice and promote equity through supportive personal relationship and public acts of sponsorship and advocacy. So what you'll notice here is that I underlined certain keywords there, right? And so when we think about allyship, we think about this strategic alliance, right? Strategically aligning ourselves with a person or people and saying, okay, when I advocate or when I sponsor this person, I want to be strategic in how I go about doing it so that way we can actually affect change. And then I also underlined some other words such as fight and promote, because there you see the action behind it, right? And supportive and public acts. And so that's why I felt like this was a really great definition because it really emphasizes the importance of engaging in meaningful action in order to be an effective ally. And so here, it says to be an ally is to take on the struggle as your own. And so this is really big. And a part of this requires, we'll talk about that on number 6, but it requires decentering yourself and saying, okay, I am going to put this person or this group of individuals and their needs above my own. I'm going to take on their experience personally so that I can be effective in my advocacy. And so if you look at the second bullet point, it says, you transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. And so when we think about allyship, we think about, for example, I talked about Black Lives Matter and how you have people of all races and ethnicities who were there to support the movement, or you think about LGBT rights. And even if you do not identify as LGBT, you can align yourself with the movement or with a certain cause in order to effectively, like I said, effectively promote and support that particular cause. And so the third one is really important as well. And so it says to amplify voices of the oppressed before your own. And the reason why this is so important is because oftentimes when we think of allyship, we think of, okay, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to stand up and speak up for this person. But instead of speaking up for that person, you can position yourself to say, you know what, I think, let's see, we got here, Larry in the group. I think Larry has a really good idea. I think we should hear what Larry has to say. Larry and I discussed this important topic the other day, and I think we should really support our colleague and listen to what he has to say about this matter, right? And so when you amplify the voices of the oppressed before your own, you're not necessarily speaking for the person, or you're creating a space where they can speak for themselves. So you're supporting them in that. And so for the fourth bullet point, it says, acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you. And this is so critical. Again, you have to decenter yourself and remember that whatever or whoever you're supporting, that it is about those individuals and their experiences, and maybe some of the different things that they're experiencing within the workforce or just in general. And so the fifth one is hard. And I'll tell you, even as a chief diversity officer, I have been in positions where I was afraid to stand up and say something because I knew I was going up against systems that were not just necessarily designed for the success of underrepresented minorities and certain individuals in mind. And so it can be scary to stand up and say, we should consider changing this process to be more inclusive or to be more equitable. But if you don't stand up and don't speak up, then, it's a missed opportunity. And if you truly want to have an organization that is equity centered, then you have to be able to have those difficult conversations, and you have to be able to speak up when it's time to. And so even if it's scary, and that's why, like, going back to the other slide, I said be strategic. That's the important part of it too, because you don't want to just, burst into a meeting and say, you know what, I don't like how Karen is being treated. You want to have a little more strategy behind it, and maybe say, could we set up a meeting to talk about some different things going on and how we can be more inclusive for our colleagues. And so that's why it's really important to have the strategy behind it as well. And number 6 is own your mistakes and decenter yourself. I always say, just diversity, equity, and inclusion in general is a journey. It is, you're going to always learn and grow and evolve. One thing I had to recently correct myself on, as an example, is I used to use the term tone deaf all the time, like, oh, that's such a tone deaf gesture. But then, someone politely corrected me and said, that has an ableist undertone to it. Perhaps you should use another term to describe that. And she was absolutely right. I was like, I didn't think about that for, people who may be hard of hearing or deaf. When you use terms like tone deaf, it does have that ableist connotation to it. And so I corrected myself. I owned my mistake. And then I continue to center the experiences of others in the room. And then the last one is really important, and that's to understand that your education is up to you. So a lot of times, when you're working with different people of different cultures, different backgrounds, people aren't going to always tell you what they need in order to feel more included or to feel a sense of belonging. And so it's up to you to ask, or it's up to you to learn as much as you can in order to create that space, and so that you can be a better ally or advocate. But education is key. And unlearning is important too. I'll talk about that a little later, but sometimes we do have different biases, and we have to acknowledge that those biases are there. And so that's why I say unlearning is just as important as learning. And so, we hear this term thrown around a lot, right? Oh, I want to be an ally. I'm an ally. I want to support the cause. And so when we think about allyship, we have to think about why it's important in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I found this information, and I really love this because it hones in on why allyship is an important component of DE&I. So that first bullet point, it says, fostering an inclusive, equitable, and diverse workplace through allyship is a lifelong, imperfect journey, starting with active listening, research, and education. And so there's a few things that stand out there, right? It is a lifelong, imperfect journey. And so that goes back to my other statement where I mentioned that you're always going to be learning and growing. So just don't beat yourself up if you say something that may have been incorrect, or if you may have done something to offend someone. You just own that and say, I apologize, and I will try to do better in the future, and I will always keep that in mind, right? Whatever you may have done or said, and you move on from it, you grow. But don't get stuck there. And I see that happen from time to time too. Um, and I can think of a really specific example. So I am a practicing Catholic, and I actually had a conversation with a priest, and he is a white man, and he admitted the reason that he does not feel comfortable talking about certain racial justice and social justice issues with some of the parishioners, some of the members of the church, is because in the past he said something that offended someone, and so now he just stays away from it. He's like, I'm not going to touch this. And so what I told him, I said, I understand you being a little hesitant because you don't want to offend or make any mistakes, but you have to understand, every time you don't say anything, you have a group of individuals who feel like, well, he never sticks up for us. He's silent on this matter. He claims to be about, all people and care about all lives, but he's not saying anything about the experiences of Black parishioners or Hispanic parishioners or LGBT parishioners. And so what I told him was, DE&I is a journey. You are going to say some things that may offend someone, and you just have to correct yourself and listen to what they're telling you. And that goes to the listening and education part, right? Take the time to say, okay, I understand that in the past I may have said some things that were not correct, but I want to revisit this and really listen to everyone's experience and have these conversations. And so I just use that as an example because I think it's really important for people to understand that it is an ongoing journey, and you're always going to be growing in this process. And so for that second bullet point, it says the ally must listen to those who have been marginalized with the intent of debiasing their own world. So this goes back to the unlearning piece, right? And we all have biases. I don't care who it is. Every person on the planet has some form, has made a biased opinion or a biased judgment at some point in their life. And so in order to be a good ally, you have to acknowledge those biases are there and say, okay, I am going to work to dismantle these biases and get rid of them, so that way I can put the voice of marginalized individuals before my own. I had an example for this. I'm trying to remember. Oh, yeah, this is what I wanted to mention for this. I am a part of an organization here in Memphis, Tennessee, where I live, and we do a lot of work, like community service work. And so we work with a lot of individuals who may live in low income communities. And I saw a young lady taking a bunch of selfies, with some of the children. And they didn't even look like they wanted to be taking pictures, right? And I had to pull her to the side. I said, when you do this kind of work, it's really important, one, to make sure that there's sincerity and authenticity behind what you do. And then two, you don't want to come in. Let me go back a little bit. Another thing that she had a tendency to do was to make assumptions and try to tell others what's best for them. And so I would tell her, when you come in and you work with different individuals, you never want to come in with the mentality that you know what's best for everyone. You don't want to pretend to be an expert when you've never had to live the experiences that other people have had to experience. And I am going to go here really quickly. The thing about allyship that's really important to remember is that you never want to come off as if you have a saviorism complex. And it's really easy to do this with allyship and say, look, I'm supporting people. I'm doing what's best for them. I, right? And you hear it over and over, like, wait a minute, hold on, pause. Because I will rein a person in the state. But remember, when you call yourself an ally, it's not about you. And so if you are doing this solely to, post a bunch of selfies online or to and that's the performative piece, right? To say like, oh, look, I care, and there's no real sincerity or authenticity behind it, then it's not true allyship. It's performative. And so going to that third bullet point, as an ally, listening to different or new perspectives is an essential first step in creating effective initiatives. And this is so, I cannot stress this enough. In order to know, okay, how can I be a better ally? First, you have to understand the experiences of those you are trying to support. And so that's why I say it's really important to ask questions and say, I noticed in the meeting that when Jill made the comment, it made you really uncomfortable. Why did that make you uncomfortable? Would it be helpful if I speak up in future meetings if she makes that comment again, so that, you're not trying to advocate for yourself alone, right? And so that's why it's really important to ask different questions and to understand different perspectives. And then this last one is really, this is really important too, and it gets overlooked. But researching past historical events, following current events, and joining social justice groups, and learning the best ways to communicate with and engage others creates a solid foundation for these conversations. And this is really important too, especially I want to focus on the past historical events, right? Because if you don't understand some of the issues that a group of individuals have had to face. So I'll talk about, for example, our indigenous populations in the US. If you don't have a sense of, some of the different things that they've had to encounter, then it's hard to say like, oh yes, I'm an ally. It's really important to know some of the different things that they currently still experience on reservations. And so one of the things I always encourage people to do is to join different social justice groups, and you don't have to join the NAACP or Urban League, but I mean, it could be even a smaller community group. It doesn't have to be large national groups, because that way you can really get to learn more about some of the events that are taking place and how you can be really effective in your allyship. And so this quote it really resonates with me. I love this. This is one of my favorite quotes whenever I talk about allyship. Ally is not a title you can claim for yourself. Being an ally is an action, not an identifier. And so that goes back to the action piece, right? It's really important to always remember that allyship and action go hand in hand. And so, one of my favorite examples of authentic allyship in action is Jessica Chastain. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with Jessica Chastain and Octavia Spencer, but they starred in a movie together called The Help. And when Jessica Chastain found out how much she was making compared to Octavia, she was livid, y'all. She was like, what? Because she advocates for pay equity for women. And so she focused on gender, but she didn't realize that there was such a huge disparity for women of color. So she was like, I thought it was just women making this low salary. I didn't realize that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous women make even less than what I'm making. And so she took the initiative to support Octavia in demanding higher pay. And then she also made it known, throughout the movie business, the industry, that, this is a pervasive problem. And because of that, Octavia was able to get 5 times her pay than what she had gotten in the past. And so I just feel like this is such a powerful example of allyship in action. Because if we don't use our privilege to speak up and support others, then it's going to be an ongoing issue, right? Had Octavia not had that conversation with Jessica, she would have never known, like, well, I'm making 5 times less than you. And that's why it's important to have those kind of conversations as well. And so I have another example here. I posted this on my LinkedIn about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. What's that? Yeah. It was around Juneteenth. And I received this really thoughtful message from a young lady on LinkedIn. And she said, you know, I really want to support Juneteenth this year, but I don't want my allyship to come off performative. And she was very self-conscious about it. She was like, I know as a white woman, I have certain privileges, but this is something I really want to support. And so I sent her this list of recommendations. I said, absolutely, I would be happy to tell you some different ways that you can actively support in a way that's authentic. And then I asked her, I said, is it okay if I post this to my LinkedIn page for other people who may want to know more about how they can be an ally for Juneteenth? And she said, oh, absolutely. And so I posted this just as an example. So if you notice here, I have some actionable steps. So for example, number one, if there's events taking place in your community, support those events, support Black-owned businesses, volunteer with local organizations that do advocacy, racial equity, and civil rights work. Learn about Black history through literature and support Black authors. So that goes back to the education piece. Visit museums that focus on elevating Black history and culture and support Black artists, right? And so if you look at this list I have, these are all actionable items, right? It's not, I didn't say anything about, okay, post on your Instagram a Black box, you know, or post on your Instagram, you know, a selfie with you and a group of children. I gave very specific actionable steps. And so that's how we have to think about allyship, as action. And so now I want to talk about Karen Catlin's 7 types of allyship. And she wrote about this in a book called Better Allies. So this is not, I'm not taking credit for this at all. I'm just talking about it so that you all can know like the different types of allies. And so you'll see here, there are 7. And we'll start with the first one. The first one is sponsorship, right? So a sponsor openly supports colleagues from underrepresented groups in professional contexts in the workplace. They'll recommend a colleague for projects and talk about their expertise. As a sponsor, you can point out development opportunities and offer practical support. So I am very open about telling people that I would not be where I am today if I did not have the support of certain sponsors in the workforce. And the first time I realized that I had someone sponsoring me is when I was working at Georgia State University. And I had a great boss. Her name was Heather Housley, and she is a white woman. And she was the director of the department I was working in. And she kept saying, you know, Mary, you should consider going to grad school, go back to school, and I'll write a letter of support for you. And I will connect you with some of the faculty I know in the department. And so for me, that's always the first example that comes to mind, because she made it her priority to say, you know, I'm going to support you on your academic journey. I want you to know, even though I know if you do go to school full time, that means you won't work with us full time anymore. But seeing you succeed is more important than, you know, you staying here and not growing. And so for me, that really meant a lot to me, because I did end up leaving Georgia State University to go to Auburn University to pursue full-time academic studies. But that's a great example of sponsorship. Let's see, I'm checking the time there. Okay, 12:24. Okay, so a champion sends out a powerful message by voluntarily deferring to colleagues from underrepresented groups in meetings, events, and conferences. You can be a champion by suggesting colleagues as panelists or recommending them to speak for you if they are equally fit. And so we hear that all the time, like, I champion this cause, I champion this group. And so essentially it's very similar to sponsorship, but not quite. But basically you're taking an active role to speak up and say, you know, I think this person would be a great fit for this position or for this role, or they deserve to be recognized as well. So advocate. When an ally takes on the role of the advocate, that ally uses their power and influence to bring peers from underrepresented groups into highly exclusive circles. The advocate recognizes and addresses unjust omissions holding their peers accountable for including qualified colleagues of all genders, races, and ethnicities, abilities, ages, body shapes or sizes, religions, and sexual orientations. So, one of the things about advocacy is that you do take on the role um, of holding others accountable. And this is the part where it can become a little like, oh, this is scary. I got to speak up. Um, but it's an important role because if we don't use our privilege to advocate for others, then we'll never be able to dismantle inequitable systems, right? Like I said, you go back, you look at history. In every major movement, there was always allies aligning themselves with the cause, and they knew the power of their voice. They knew the power of aligning themselves with a group of individuals or a certain cause because they knew that people would listen to them. If a group of men at the women's suffrage movement say, you know what, this is wrong, you're absolutely right, women should be able to vote, we should not exclude half of our population, then other men and other people are more likely to listen to them because they do have a certain privilege and people do listen to what they have to say. And so that's the thing about advocacy. You do speak up and you do call out certain things. And it's very important. As scary as it can be at times, if you're strategic with how you do it, then you can definitely make an impact. Amplifier. So when an ally takes on the role of the amplifier, they focus on ensuring that a wide range of voices are heard. This type of allyship can take many forms, but is focused on representation within communication. I had a former supervisor who was really good at this. He was very intentional in making sure that he had a diverse team. And I still talk to him to this day. And he was also very intentional in making sure that it wasn't like tokenism or perceived as tokenism, but he really wanted to have representation in terms of race, ethnicity, backgrounds, because he knew that in order for us to best serve students, our students were diverse, come from all backgrounds, that we have to represent the population we serve. And so I say students because I used to work in higher education. I still do some consulting work with a lot of colleges and universities. But the amplifier typically focuses on representation and making sure that you have a diverse group of individuals at the table. And so the scholar, so when an ally takes on the role of the scholar, that ally seeks to learn as much as possible about the challenges and prejudices faced by colleagues. It's important to know that scholars never insert their opinions, experiences, or ideas, but instead simply listen and learn. Scholars do their own research to seek out the relevant information. And you know, when you see this term scholar, you automatically assume like, okay, is this some academic professor doing this work? And I do know quite a few academic professors who do work around racial equity and social justice. And so they write quite a bit of publications, but it doesn't just have to be someone in the academic setting, right? It could be anyone who has a commitment and the drive to learn. So, I mean, you could just purchase books to learn about the history and the cultures of different groups, right? And so you are not necessarily inserting your experience in that, but you're learning as much as you can and you seek out relevant information. So that way, if a person does ask, well, why is this like this? Why do we have such an issue with race in the United States? Then you can answer that question. And you can answer it from a perspective based on just literature and what you have learned as a scholar. And the upstander. So when an ally takes on the role of the upstander, that ally acts as the opposite of a bystander. The upstander is someone who sees wrongdoing and acts to combat it. This person pushes back on offensive comments or jokes, even if no one within earshot might be offended or hurt. So the upstander, this person is usually, they are usually brave, I guess you could say, or or even if they do feel a little hesitancy about speaking up, they usually are the type of individuals who are going to be the first ones to speak up out against something that they perceive to be offensive or inequitable. And you need upstanders, right? You need people who are at the marches who are like, with the signs like, this is absolutely wrong, we don't stand for this, right? And so I think that was the last one. Oh, one more. And so the last one is confidant. When an ally takes on the role of the confidant, that ally creates a safe space for members of underrepresented groups to express their fears, frustrations, and needs. Simply listening to their stories and trusting that they're being truthful creates a protective layer of support. Now, this role is so important. And a lot of times when we think of allies, we think of, the more outspoken individuals who are at marches or who speak out in meetings. But serving as a confidant and supporting someone and saying, I have an open door. If you ever need to come talk to me, feel free to come talk to me. Right. And so at the last organization where I worked, we had a safe space program for our LGBT faculty, students, and staff. And so we had there was an identifier outside of our door to say this is a safe space. So if you ever need to come talk, you can come here. And so that's an example of that, and the importance of being able to trust someone and to be able to confide in them about the experiences that you're going through is really important. And so now I think we have so we still have about 30 minutes or so. I would like to open it up for discussion. And so I have a few questions here. What does allyship mean to you? Tell us about a time when you have seen allyship put into action. And in your opinion, what are some effective ways to promote and engage in allyship in the workplace? And just know you don't have to answer every question if you do decide to answer one of the questions. All right. It looks like Sonia has her hand raised.
I sure do. Hi, and thanks, Mary, for the presentation. That was really interesting. A lot to go over and a lot of stuff that resonated with me. So thank you for that. I guess I wanted to just start out with, I think that, yes, I totally agree and resonated with the idea that allyship is not like a title you put on yourself. But I also just wanted to point out what an honor it is when it finally, when it does actually happen, right? And I had kind of this moment in my experience where I didn't even realize that I was being an ally. I'm a openly Christian person who worked as the first openly Christian person at a humanist, atheist, agnostic community for my field education intern at my graduate program. And it was really quite an experience because I found myself navigating all of my marginalized identities while also trying to acknowledge and understand the marginalized identities that were around me. Because a lot of the people who are wearing what I'll say are like kind of majority identities on their face, right, underneath, often would feel excluded from conversations related to spirituality. And so dealing with that kind of tension was really interesting. And so I found myself making a lot of space for different people, and also people kind of calling me into these different conversations and staying for extra time after meetings and things like that. And I guess towards the end of that experience, there was this sort of day celebrating the community. And of course I was there because it became my community too in a lot of ways. But what they surprised me with was they actually said, we actually want to bring someone up who's, been working with us over the last couple of years, and she could have been doing her theological studies at a theological institution, but instead she chose to be here, and she found this to be an important place to be. And they were talking about me. And so it was like a day of recognition for allyship. And I never thought about it in terms of that, but this presentation really, I think, highlighted exactly what ways folks were seeing that. And it gives me really good language to talk about it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, awesome. And congratulations on that too. And it is like a wonderful feeling to know, like, okay, I've made a difference, I've helped others. And even when you're not necessarily going for the recognition, right? You're doing it because it's something that you're really committed to. Absolutely. So kudos to you, Sonia. It looks like we have Teresa has her hand raised.
Sorry about that. I had needed to take myself off mute and turn my camera on. I apologize. My internet is a little unstable, so I felt myself, my head going in and out of frame. So I just turned my camera off. Um, First of all, great presentation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the information that you've shared. I am the person in my organization that host a monthly conversation on diversity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace. And I am always seeking to learn more and expand my knowledge in this area. So I really appreciated your presentation today. And I just wanted to mention that we have a person in our organization who is a director of communications in the president's office. And so he has the president's ear, and he is the epitome of what I will call someone who is an ally to my department and the work that we do. He has amplified the work that we do. He has advocated for the work that we do. He has literally attended almost every session that we've held. And I think this month, tomorrow to be exact, because our meetings are usually the last Thursday of the month from 11:30 until 12:30. And I believe this is our 16th or 17th session, and he's probably attended 15 of them. And whenever he cannot attend, he always lets us know. But he doesn't just attend. I mean, he participates in the conversations. He, goes back and again, he amplifies the work that we do. Anytime that he is, talking to the president, which is pretty regularly, he is talking about how, he and the president, should be supporting the work that we do and make sure that we have the resources that we have, that we need. So when I think about what an ally is, I think about Stephen Mayberry by name, because he is the epitome of what an ally is. And anytime you have someone in your organization who is amplifying the work that you do, like, you just can't get better, you can't get a better commercial, right, than
Right.
that. And so I just wanted to mention that I hope that others have a Stephen Mayberry in their organization who not only acts as an ally, but again stands and amplifies and advocates for the work that we all do. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Teresa. We all need Stephen Mayberry's, don't we?
We all need a Stephen Mayberry.
Every workplace needs it. I
Yep.
know not every workplace has it, but in an ideal utopian world, that would be, we would have so many Stevens. Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate you all for speaking and sharing your experiences. So I do have a few more things I want to touch on really quickly. And I know I only have about maybe 20 minutes left. But I think when you talk about allyship, right, it's important to talk about performative allyship too, and the effects of it. And a lot of people, even when they have good intentions, they kind of miss the mark sometimes, right? And we see it with a lot of organizations, and we saw this rise in the number of organizations that have made these commitments. After the killing of George Floyd and several others, they made these big commitments, like, oh, we're gonna rehaul our organization. We're gonna do all this work to look at our policies, protocols, and processes. We're gonna hire more, people with underrepresented identities. They made all these promises. And I just read an article the other day where it's like, okay, a lot of organizations have failed flat. And a big reason for this is I I think some organizations know exactly what they're doing, but there are genuinely some who do not understand the difference between performative and authentic, actionable allyship. And so I want to read this statement because it's a really great definition of what performative allyship is, right? And so performative allyship is where those with privilege profess solidarity with the cause. This assumed solidarity is usually vocalized, disingenuous, and potentially harmful to marginalized groups. Often, the performative ally professes allegiance in order to distance themselves from potential scrutiny. In many cases, organizational leaders use performance driven activity in a way that they believe will protect company brand from being highlighted in a negative way. Now, feel free to raise your hand if you have seen, a company or an organization engage in allyship that can be perceived as performative based on this definition. Exactly. A lot of us have. And what a lot of organizations do, and a lot of organizations have this problem where we become reactionary and we say, oh, we have to do something and we have to, market this in a way so we look like that we're a part of this cause, right? And in turn, it can have negative effects. So I have a few more quotes I want to read here. So without meaningful action, however well-meaning your platitudes, performative allyship can stifle progress and suppress attempts to foster genuinely inclusive workplaces. I have a very specific example for this. So remember how I talked about I had a really great supervisor. He was very intentional in making sure, he had a diverse representative population in terms of his team that reflected the student body. I also had another colleague of mine who would hire and it was clear tokenism. He would hire one person here and then one person there. And, I had to finally have a conversation with him and say, when you put people in these positions, they know exactly what you're doing. Nobody wants to be the token hire, right? And and he wasn't very inclusive either in how he interacted with them. And so we had a really good conversation about it. And I truly believed he didn't see anything wrong with what he was doing, but had to be called out on it and like, hey, you're hiring. This can be perceived as tokenism if you're not conscious of what you're doing. And so another quote here says, when performative allyship embeds itself into an organization's culture, it sends the signal that while it is right to show solidarity with the problems faced by marginalized groups, they're not important enough to tackle properly. And this is why performative allyship can be incredibly harmful, because if you simply say verbally like, okay, yes, we stand for this. This is who we are as an organization. We are committed to anti-racism and social justice, but then you don't do anything to dismantle the systems that oppress the very people you claim to have solidarity with, then all you're doing as an organization is causing more harm. And so that's why I feel like it's really important. I talked to a lot of organizations about this, and, I explain it in a way where, I do equity audits. So I'll, show them the data and give them different reports to show them, this is why this is important to have action behind everything you do. And so in closing, I just want to kind of wrap up with these closing thoughts. And then if you have any questions or if you want to discuss at the end, we can do that. But 7 ways to be a better ally. And this is just based on, research I've done and different things I've heard over the years. And so examine and understand your privileges. This is important. And we all have privileges, whether we recognize it or not. And so it's important for us to understand, okay, what are my privileges, right? And then how can I use my privileges to better support those who may not have the same privileges? And just going back to the educate yourself piece, this is really important, whether you have conversations directly with the individuals you're supporting, or if you choose to be a scholar, right, and learn from literature and readings and documentaries, or however that may look. It's really important to be educated and well informed. This one, I said this to my priest, right? Unlearning is just as important as learning. And I said, yeah, you may have made some mistakes in the past. You may have shown some bias towards certain groups in the past, but you recognize that those were certain behaviors and tendencies that you had to unlearn so that you can better connect with people with different identities in your parish. So remember this, when you are learning, that unlearning certain behaviors and tendencies is equally important. And then the next one, listen first. This goes back to the decentering yourself piece, right? And putting the experiences of others before your own and amplifying the voices of others before your own. resist the urge to be seen as an expert. This goes back to the young lady, the example I gave with the young lady. We were out in the community and she always thought she knew what was best. And I finally had to say, hey, we don't live in this community. Let's listen to what the residents have to say and what they want to see and the kind of changes they feel like would be important. And so this is why it's really important. You never want to go in as a know-it-all. I can't think of another term, but you never want to go in with this idea that you know what's best for a group of individuals. And then leverage your time, resources, and talents to actively support others. So we kind of talked about some different examples of this, whether it's, coming to meetings and supporting different meetings or supporting different causes and saying, you know what, not only am I going to support by going to the meetings, but I'm also going to support by providing a donation, or I'm going to volunteer my time and talents to help support this cause. So it's equally important. And lastly, I cannot stress this enough. Remember that allyship is a journey, not a destination. So you're going to always grow and you're going to always learn in the process. And in order to become a better ally, you just embrace that. And that's it. Just embrace the journey. And that's DEI as well. Like, it's always changing. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Let's see, there we go. And so if you have any questions or final thoughts that you would like to share, I think we